Thomas, how's it going today?
It's great. It's cold, but
It's cold
it's
indeed.
good.
I just got back from Mexico and it was really nice soaking up that vitamin D, getting all that sunshine. And then I came back and it was 2 o'clock or two degrees and I woke up this morning here in
Oh
Illinois.
yeah. And you
With
probably
180.
left the Midwest when it was fairly warm. Did you leave during
It was
that?
like 30s. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right
yeah.
on yeah. So quite the temperature swing.
So that's a slight shock to the system.
This is good
Yeah,
though.
yeah, it is. It does feel good, but we get soft so easy that, you probably see it in the fall. You hunt a lot more in the fall, and, a few of these all day sits, and they're exhausting. It's a lot for a soft human like us to spend the whole day in the elements when we're not acclimated to it. But it's funny how after just a couple of hunts, then you get used to it. Your
Yeah.
fingers don't get as cold and stuff like that. But then you take like 3 days off and then you get back out there. You ride out a couple of these long 20-degree windy November days, and then all of a sudden you take a few days off and you go back out and it's only like 40 degrees, but you're just like, oh man, it's so cold out here.
Yeah.
Then you think back, it's like, well, how much time have I actually spent outside in the last 72 hours? So
Yeah.
yeah, we get soft real fast. But no, it's great to be on. It's good
Yeah.
to chat with
Return
you.
returning guest. I think the last time you were on here was, I want to say September or August of 2021, I would say.
Okay. Yeah,
And
that sounds about right. A couple years.
and so for folks that haven't gone back and listened to those episodes, we did one for the Land podcast, we did one for the Exodus podcast, and you have quite the experience of hunting whitetails in Wisconsin primarily, and a lot of really good key elements of improving your hunting ability. So we're going to be talking about a lot of that, but I'll give you an opportunity to introduce yourself.
Well, my name is Thomas Mlsna. My business, my company is the Untamed Ambition. So at its core, I'm a habitat consultant and a whitetail hunting coach. And I say that and I try to differentiate because I think there's just so many ways that you can be a successful whitetail hunter, that if you just fall into this trap of like soaking up someone else's opinion or what worked for them, that you can hinder yourself and your own abilities in your own situation. So I consult on habitat, native habitat primarily, and current situations that people are operating with, and then I coach on the hunting side of things. Obviously it all ties together at the end of the day, but yeah, I live and work out of southwestern Wisconsin, La Crosse, Wisconsin, but I have clients all throughout the Midwest. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of me in a nutshell. My background's in biology. I went to college for wildlife biology and natural resources, and I grew up on a large dairy farm. So at this point in my career, I'm doing everything that I can to kind of bring those things together. The farming side and the hunting side, or the recreational property side, they go hand in hand most of the time, right? You've got a lot of hunters out there that own properties where part of the property is tillable land. But then obviously you have the food plot side. So every hunter out there that's doing food plots tries to be a farmer for at least a couple weeks out of the year.
Yeah, exactly. It's a couple of weeks out of the year is pretty much how it goes for most folks. Do you think hunters have a glass ceiling, or do you think everyone that takes it serious enough or puts in enough effort can shoot mature bucks every year, or almost every year, I'd say?
I mean, at the end of the day, it's all about the time that you put in, right? I mean, I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt, the reason I didn't kill a buck last year on our property was because I didn't put enough time into it. I had a lot of really, really good encounters, and I had a really good plan going into the season, but the variables changed. The pressure increased on our property. And, to be a little bit more specific, the buck that I was after was living in this valley when he was on our property, who was living in this valley that just so happened to be the valley where our hunting cabin is. And my family, I share the property with 17 other people, and they decided that they wanted to hunt more this fall, which is great. I do not want to discourage that by any means, but you go from a low pressure environment to an intermittent high pressure environment. There's pressure for the weekend, and then there's no pressure in the weekend. It just kind of ebbs and flows, and that changed everything. And it took a lot more effort to catch up with that deer, and I just started to run out of time. And then it gets later in the season, and I'm trying to manage clients and client properties and their success, and I've got 2 young kids at home, and all this stuff going on. It's like, oh man, it's like, do you push further? And I that's every season for me, and it's a lot easier for me to make those sacrifices as far as how I prioritize my time when I'm chasing a 180 or 200 inch deer, but this was like 145-inch great deer by all means. But it's like, man, at the end of the day, it's like, when you have to make those decisions, like, I'll just let them go.
There's always a sobering experience every year for me where you're like, all right, time to go back to put on your grown-up pants every day. Because I'm personally very selfish for about a month and a half, where it's like, I'm certainly not the best version of myself during that time frame. And then there's a point where it's like, all right, it's time to get back to reality.
I can 100% relate to that. I mean, it's like, I'm sure you can relate to this. I live my life in those cycles of the fall, right? It's like you do everything you can throughout the off season to put yourself in position for success in the fall. And that means, getting caught up with everything that you need to do, knowing that you're going to hit this 1 to 3 month period where you're just kicking the can with everything else in life outside of the hunting season. And then those things, you hit that threshold where, I always go into it like, okay, I'm just going to kill this deer in the first couple of weeks, and then I've got all season. And then something comes up, or, I'll pass up the worst. My wife always gives me grief over situations like this, where I'll pass up like a really, really nice deer, right? Like a stud 5-year-old or something. I'm like, that's not the deer I was after. That's not the deer I'm hunting. I'm like, it was a great encounter. I just love those encounters with mature bucks. I'm like, that's not the deer I was after. She's like, well, if you would have killed that deer, then you'd be home more. Like, yeah, I understand that, but you only get so many ruts in your lifetime, right? It's like,
exactly,
you put all these things off, and then all of a sudden, the season comes to an end. You're like, oh, okay, now it's go time again. So there's never any downtime. I think about that frequently. It's like, if we weren't hunters, then life would, it just kind of would flow in this routine. But it's so, it's so intermittent with how, like, the levels of stress. It's like, well, I guess it's not intermittent with the levels, just the different types of levels of stress, or different levels of stress in general. But
isn't that crazy how much less relaxed deer get throughout the season? I mean, it is noticeable where does are like super nonchalant, really don't care, you can get away with murder. And then by the end of the season, it's like a twig non-related to your hunt snaps, like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. That's spot on. And that's what I saw. I took my son out, sneaking in, being all stealthy, using cover to our advantage, as you should, right? We get down the valley, and I look across the valley, and I can see like 10 does like just filing out of the valley. I'm like, oh, well, gig's up, and so try and pull that on a mature buck, it's just not going to happen. But no, to your point, does a hunter hit a ceiling? I think they do if they think that they know everything, or what I see frequently is guys find success in one way, shape, or form, and then they just follow that routine forever, right? You see this a lot, where someone will have they'll hang a stand, and they'll kill a nice deer out of that stand, and then they hunt that stand all the time, right? Or it can be as simple as like your food plot regimen. Well, I did this and it worked, and the deer loved it, and I'm just going to keep doing that. Well, sometimes those things work out really well, sometimes they don't. So we put that glass ceiling there on ourselves if we think that we know everything all the time. And the best piece of advice, yeah, exactly, you have to evolve, you have to adapt, and the best thing that you can do is approach your season with a good plan, but don't ever think that you know everything. I still, every single day that I hunt, my goal is to learn something, right? How are deer moving today? How are they moving this week? Or how can I hunt this area better? Again, approaching things, trying to learn all the time, objectively approaching things. The advantage I had was that the farm's broken up where it almost hunts like 3 or 4 different properties. And, when I worked for 10 years in the outdoor industry as a trail camera
we don't say that word on here. I'm just kidding. Yeah. You worked at Reconics in the past. I mean, if anyone's curious.
Yeah. So I spent 10 years as a customer service manager at Reconics, and the big part of my job, above and beyond helping customers be successful with their trail camera use and everything, and fixing trail cameras. But the big thing that I would do is prototype, test, develop new products. So there was a point in time where I had, I think I had like 65 or 70 cameras running on this property throughout the season. And now I've actually backed off a lot. I still have a lot of cameras, and a lot of them I just don't use because it just becomes too much. It's too much information to try and process in a short amount of time.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit, because I think that's one thing that most people just don't run 65 cameras on one property because most people aren't in a position to do that. What were some key findings, good and bad, of running that many cameras? I mean, obviously, you mentioned it's just too much data to process, but just talk a little bit about some of those key findings.
Yeah. So like you said, I mean, the big thing is time, right? It's like, how do you invest your time throughout the season? If you have a 40-acre property or something with 65 cameras on it, you're not doing yourself a favor with that many cameras. One, you're putting way too much pressure on that property with the cameras themselves, and also your presence checking that many cameras. Even if they're all cell cameras, and if they are all cell cameras, that's just a lot. It's expensive running that many cameras, that many batteries. I mean, what's a set of
that is a
lithium batteries run? Yes,
yeah.
exactly. But no, it's a lot of information. It's a lot of time. So you have to look at the fact of, how can I invest my time, and also, am I using my cameras correctly to get that information? And this is it's kind of an analogy to how humans operate. Instead of being more efficient with less, we just try to add more to make up for our inefficiencies, right? So yeah. But that was one of the things that I actually honestly wanted to just test out at that point in my life, where one example of that is, I was after this buck one year. He was frequenting this food plot, this transition food plot, right before dark, and then after dark they would transition out into the big ag field. So it was a really, really nice setup. That food plot was only like 25 yards from the neighbor's property. And I could not figure out, for the life of me, I could not figure out where this buck was coming from. And this is based off of having one camera on that food plot. So then it went from having one camera on that food plot to having 2 cameras on that food plot. And then pretty soon I had 3 cameras on that food plot. By mid-October, I had like 7 or 8 cameras around this 1/4-acre food plot, either on the food plot or on trails leading to the food plot. Yeah, it's not a very big food plot at all. Yeah. But I could not dial in where this buck was coming from at that time. I always had the theory, like, oh, he's coming from here, he's coming from there. And, based on those 4 key elements that I talk about all the time: the wind, pressure, food, and timing. I'm just like, man, how is he approaching this food plot, and all these things? I had a couple opportunities, or a couple of experiences that, just kind of prove that much data isn't beneficial at the end of the day. And that's, you have to bank on having a good plan and then adjusting your plan by proving and disproving those theories. And most of the time, if your camera's in a good situation or a good setup, you're going to accomplish that. And the other thing too with trail cameras that I try to get guys to understand in general is that, a camera should only be there as a sampling of what's going on in your property. You should not expect to get a picture of that buck every single time he's on that food plot, or every single time he goes through that travel corridor. He's not going to check that mock scrape or hit that water hole every single time he comes through there. Sometimes he's going to skirt the edge. Sometimes he's going to walk right by it. Sometimes he'll stop and sniff it, whatever it may be. But I learned real quickly that information just can be overwhelming. And then, fast forward a few years, having kids and having, prioritizing giving them time, or, having a business, prioritizing that time. It's like, now sitting down to check trail cameras, what used to be really exciting to me, and it still is, right? But what used to be really exciting, because I could invest that time. Now it's like sitting down to try and go through all those cards is a significant investment in time.
It is.
So I've learned, like, if you fine tune those setups and get just a handful of those cameras that you understand that are going to be high value cameras, then you can focus on just a handful of cameras, and that information that you get from them is higher in value in general. And you don't get so scatterbrained, because it's easy. Back to the food plot story. It's really easy to get a picture of a buck walking past your camera, and he's going from one direction to the other, and be like, okay, he came from there and he's going here. And that was another one of those things that I was trying to prove or disprove with the cameras was, we know, you should know for the most part, that when a mature buck approaches a food plot, he's going to try to get some sort of advantage. He's not just going to pop out in there. So is he going to take the high ground and come out on top so he can kind of scope out the area? Or is he going to take the low ground where the thermals are settling so he can get a better scent advantage, or just utilize cover as long as he absolutely can before he hits this open food source? Or, the more obvious, is he going to circle downwind of that food plot and try to approach from the downwind side? And one night I actually went out there with a climber and set up like 20 yards downwind of that food plot on this trail leading up to it, thinking I was going to outsmart him because, again, wind, pressure, food, timing, the way the conditions laid out, I'm like, he's going to show up tonight and he's going to come down this trail. Well, the interesting part of having all these cameras there was I sat there, I didn't see a single deer that night. And I got down, pulled my climber, walked across the corner of the food plot where I had one camera set up, walked out the other end of the food plot where I had another camera set up. And then a week later or so, I went back and hunted again and pulled all those cards. Well, it turned out that 1 minute after I crossed that food plot, that buck showed up on that trail where I was hunting on that camera. So I had that information. It was good to know. So I was in the right spot. I was just, it just wasn't the right night for him to move at the right time.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually I figured out that where he came from.
One idea, or maybe for a way to help people become more effective with cameras, especially on food plots too, talking about how there's so many different areas where they can come in. Are you a big believer in edge feathering to make it to where like now they have maybe 2 or 3 versus an infinite amount where they can pop into
Absolutely.
it?
Absolutely. Yep. So when I put my habitat plans together, specifically structured for hunting, I use Onyx all the time. And the main reason I map everything out is just to visualize things. But then also the way my plans are executed with the clients is they can go through this punch list and basically, they can look at these things in real time in the field, right on the exact location. And then they can add notes. And then if they have questions down the road, I just log into their account and all of these notes are there. When I scout their property, I log into their account. I add all the scouting notes right in there and everything. But I have two different types of edge feathering that I put on the plans. One I map as a dashed purple line. You probably saw this on the plan when we did the virtual consultation.
Talked about, for anyone listening too. So we talked about in depth where I live here and put together a plan. And that was something that I really liked too, was creating a lot more interior edge by actually planting plants, good native shrubs versus just cutting trees down. And every situation is a little bit different, but continue on.
Yep. Yeah. So the 2 different types of edge feathering that I utilize and how I map them out. One is the dashed line. And that really is just to create a better edge. And to be more clear on that, a good beneficial wildlife edge is about 30 to 40 feet thick, right? Doesn't always have to be that thick, but if you get an edge that thick, now you're providing an abundance of food and cover for all that wildlife. That first row of cover is where those does want to spend most of their time bedding, and they spend a lot of time there. And when you have that good row of cover, that good 30 or 40 foot thick edge, now you're pulling your does up close to your food source. You're giving your bucks a lot more space than the rest of your property. So a dashed purple line is your typical feathered edge. We're going in there, we're hinging a few trees, we're cutting a lot of trees. We're essentially going through and cutting out all the low quality trees on that edge and trying to encourage more shrubby growth and more understory tree growth. That's where you see a lot more of your crab apples and stuff like that growing. And if you ever find a crab apple tree on an edge, it's always loaded with scrapes. The deer tend to flock to those as a social hub. But then the second form of edge feathering that I utilize is what I refer to as an edge barrier. And I'll draw that on the map as a solid purple line, which is what you're explaining or what you're asking about. And then what I do is, you draw that line. So, say you have this small food plot or even a big food plot, and deer can enter from any location. Well, if you draw that line, I draw that line to help visualize it, but if you cut that line, and then we're utilizing more hinge cutting as barriers and, just trying to create kind of a mess between point A and point B to force those deer to enter from one end or the other and commit to that. And then, yes, it puts you in a better shot situation. It also, puts you in a situation or a better target area for your trail camera. So you're getting more consistent activity.
And that's the thing.
Correct.
Yeah, more efficient cameras, more efficient data to make better time decisions. That's really it. It's more than just predicting deer or making deer go where they want. Like you get better data.
Correct. But now there's one thing I want to add to this, and I know you're familiar with this situation, is this whole timber wall type concept.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that
and up. I think that there's a line where you can create these edges and feather these edges and create barriers. I use that same purple line to kind of identify or note ravines or pinch points or where to create a better pinch point. So if I'm scouting hill country and there's a real sharp or a real deep ravine that comes up to the top of the hill, I'll draw that purple line on the map. And that's, again, that kind of notates that barrier that those deer, or some resistance that those deer are going to go around. And if there's not a ravine there, then maybe we just want to go in and cut some trees in that spot to force those deer up that hill, make them commit to taking the high travel corridor where the wind is more controlled or more favorable, or taking the low corridor. But so if you're set up on top, then you're not getting busted by deer that are a couple hundred yards down the hill from you. On that note, if you create a pinch point that's too tight, or a wall around a food plot that's, those deer can't see over at all, like it takes a lot more for them to get used to that, for them to adapt, to hit that same level of comfort, or else they get nervous. And also if they can't get out of that food plot in any spot other than, a couple of very narrow corridors, they don't like to spend as much time there, plain and simple.
Yeah.
So what's your experience, man? Because you have some timber walls.
A property that I purchased I have 2 years of data now. One of them, it was a larger plot. I'd say it's an acre and a half or so, and it was a aggressive timber wall, and I ran a lot of cameras there, and mature bucks did not spend time in it, plain and simple. So that's one of my number one projects, is to still probably leave a lot of it, but open up to where it's just a lot more smoother transition and they can feel more comfortable. And then so it's crazy because on the backside of that, the bucks would be spending time where there wasn't all these constrictions. And the only time I ever got, there's been one big buck that's been running around on this farm. It's just, he does not live on it. But anyhow, last 2 seasons ago now, the only video I ever got of him up there was chasing a doe through the middle of peak rut, like November 12th. But throughout the farm, he's spending a lot more time. So I think, to your point, there is a diminishing return of being too aggressive. And obviously it's so situational, and this property has a lot of terrain as well. So I think that's probably another added thing to where there's some areas where it's impassable. So I think there's a lot of things that go into that, but I really like the more soft edge, I feel is maybe the word I would use. And there is too much of a good thing, if that makes sense.
Correct.
Quote, unquote.
And another thing to note on the timber wall concept is, some situations vary a little bit, but for the most part, these timber walls are created when these guys are clearing land to create a food plot, and then they just, seemingly strategic. There's some strategy to pushing these piles in certain areas. Those piles are nest predator habitat too. So beyond the deer hunting aspect of a food plot, you're also creating an environment that harbors possums, skunks, raccoons, bobcats, foxes, all this stuff, which they're a very valuable part of that ecosystem, right? But a really good edge provides a lot of nesting opportunity and a lot of habitat for those ground nesting birds, the turkeys, the quail, the songbirds and stuff that are, nesting in the shrubs. And a timber wall edge is not that at all. It's literally what it is. Right? It's a wall made with timber that's laid on the ground. It's the exact opposite of the edge that you should be creating that's beneficial to all that wildlife. And to your point, it's a little bit too aggressive on those deer. So what I do, when I create those edge barriers, it really can be just as simple a difference as felling those trees perpendicular to that edge, into the field if you want to gain more edge, or into the woods if you can't afford to take up any of the field and you want to push that edge back in the woods, or you fell those trees parallel with that edge to create that barrier, and the other thing to note too is, say we have a 100-yard gap or 100-yard stretch of edge that we want to create this barrier. A lot of times you don't have to go and create a barrier for a full 100 yards. It can be as simple as just going through and plugging a couple holes, right? That's what I generally suggest clients to do, instead of getting too far ahead of yourself. Again, you only have so much time in a year, and some guys are doing everything by themselves. Some guys have a crew of people that help them. It's a little bit different, but just start by plugging some of those holes. And I've done this before where I just put a section of snow fence up in a couple of spots.
I was just going to say, a fence could be why you're developing those shrubs or whatever else. It could be a great opportunity just to put up a fence while those are growing as well, to get an instant impact.
Yeah, absolutely. So no, the edge feathering, I think it's very, very valuable. I mean, to be honest, that's probably the biggest missing component of every property that I've ever been on is edge cover in general. And I like to play this game where, I like to play games all the time. And I say that because my 5-year-old son's like, that you learn a lot better when you're playing games. He always regurgitates this information that teachers send home with him. I was like, I do know that. That's why I like to try and make things fun and exciting for my clients. But I always like to play this game because cover in general is what's generally lacking on every property. And most people, sure. Yes, correct. And I think most people miss the ball mostly just because they forget that we walk around at this 5 to 6 foot level with what our eyes see, where a deer is at that 30 to 40 inch level. And sometimes there's a little bit more here up on top versus what's down there. And then obviously things change throughout the season. But one of the things that I do all the time, because I'll always get guys that say the same thing. You're like, this is a really thick spot. This is the thickest spot on the farm. It's really thick. They like to be in here. Okay. Well, we get out there and we're 100 yards into the woods in this, potential bedding area. And we turn around and look back, and I'm like, can you see that up there? Yeah. So you can see the truck parked 300 yards across the field while we're already a couple hundred yards in the woods. Yeah. I'm like, that's a problem. Like that tells you right away, above and beyond the actual makeup of what that edge consists of as far as vegetation type, like there's just not enough cover there. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the things that I talk about all the time with those 4 key elements. The second of those key elements being pressure. There's only 2 things that reduce pressure on deer. That's cover and consistency. So you either need to increase the cover or increase the consistency of whatever that potential threat is on your property, or both. That's the ideal. Or reduce the consistency. If you're there too much in the woods, then that's a problem, because you're never going to be as consistent as what a deer thinks is consistent. It has to be on a daily basis for them to feel that it's actually consistent enough. But cover is one of those things that you can make changes and those improvements, and you have control over that aspect of your property most of the time, unless you're leasing a property. But
Dr. Grant Woods, I saw this really stuck with me. I don't follow a ton of his content, but one thing was the softball rule. If you can throw a softball and see it, then you don't have enough cover. And obviously that's dependent, throughout the country. But I can tell you this, my house, I fail that miserably, which is one of the exciting things to fix. So I think that is a good way for people to visualize, like, okay, if I threw a softball here, would I be able to see it? Or maybe a beach ball. I mean, whatever the case may be.
Yeah. Well, I think that is a really good thing. Again, a concept for people to visualize or understand things better too. And for me, if I'm setting up a property, like everything down to food plots, I don't want my deer to see more than 50 or 100 yards at any given time. And when you do that, you automatically increase the amount of movement on your property by improving the cover. So this is actually something that I'm working on right now before the show season comes up. We've got, you'll probably be down at the Iowa Deer Classic.
We'll probably stop by.
March.
I don't think we're an exhibit, but we'll be in the state. We're usually out there shooting content or shed hunting or doing something fun. What Iowa's made for, whitetail stuff.
Yeah, exactly. But I had this vision where I wanted to create this like Plinko board, where you drop the disc in the top and it bounces around and comes down at the bottom. Because I think it's hard for people to visualize this a lot of times. But if you take one of those Plinko boards and you take out 50% of the pegs in there and drop that disc in the top, it goes straight to the bottom. Maybe it hits a couple and bounces around, but for the most part, it goes straight to the bottom. Well, now you go back in there and you put all those pegs back in, or maybe even add them. I mean, how that game's designed, where the disc barely fits between them, and then that disc just bounces back and forth. That's the same exact concept on your property with mature bucks. If you have good cover on your property, especially if you have good cover in the form of good native browse, those bucks spend a lot of time there. And then on the pressure side of it, if they get bumped, a bumped deer generally just goes to the next layer of cover. Depending on the level or the severity of that bump, they just go to the next layer of cover. So if you don't have a lot of cover, how far do they have to go? Well, is it over the hill? Because topography is the greatest form of cover there is. So if they go up and over that hill, now all of a sudden they don't see you, they don't hear you, they feel secure again. And that's not what you want. You want them to go into the edge of the woods and settle down, and now they can't see you so well. Maybe they can still hear you a little bit, but they're just on alert and they feel more secure again. So when those deer are in cover, they're a lot more likely to tolerate a lot of pressures, but above and beyond that, they just don't feel that pressure, because that cover cuts down on the sight. It cuts down on the air movement in general, which carries noise and obviously scent dispersion. So cover is such a valuable aspect of a property. And that's why the switchgrass thing is so popular, right? Because switchgrass is
quick cover,
a relatively easy, quick form of cover, but it's not exactly the best that you can do for your property, in pockets here or there along edges and whatnot. But, if you have a big area, you're kind of doing your wildlife a disservice if you just focus purely on switchgrass and not more of a, native prairie habitat with pockets of shrubs. And that's what you're working on your property, right? Is putting those pockets of shrubs and trees and using those, not just in a pocket, but creating that edge, because deer are an edge species. So it's unbelievable how we kind of have gotten away from that concept of how those deer follow those edges, where, I see it all the time in our area, and I'm sure you've seen it in your area. You drive around Illinois, Iowa, southern Minnesota, now a lot of Wisconsin, where you had these fence rows that, a lot of smaller properties and fence rows separating them all, and those deer would follow those fence rows all the time. The easiest way to think about this or validate what I'm saying is next time you're driving down the road and you see a roadkill deer on the side of the road, look around. Why was that deer crossing the road in that spot? Most of the time you're going to see like a fence row or some edge that they followed to cross that road. Well, now all these edges are being removed. And I know personally on our own farm, because we're guilty of it too. And I mean, I battle this all the time with the farm. It's like, we bought neighboring farms as they sold off, and then we ripped out the fence lines. Exactly. And now that 10-acre field became a 20-acre field, and the 20-acre field became a 50-acre field, and just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's dramatically changed the amount of deer movement on the farm. And, you see it too. They're not always traveling those edges out in the wide open, obviously during the daytime, but again, back to cover, darkness, that's a form of cover. So that adds that extra level of security. And that's why a lot of times your pressured bucks wait until after dark before they start moving to reach that sense of security. But in your situation, you can draw that line, create those pockets, those little bedding pockets, but draw that line essentially to where you want those deer to flow, and they're going to follow that edge. Is it going to be 100% of the time? No, nothing is 100% of the time.
It'd be cool if it was.
Maybe, yeah, exactly.
Maybe it might get a little boring.
It would get boring, but no, the edge habitat is definitely critical, and it's such an easy thing to work on.
And people can consider this no matter where they're at or wherever they're hunting, or maybe they can't change those things. Well, you can still look for that internal edge, or you can look for the highest form of cover. I mean, a lot of these things are transcendent no matter where you're at in the country and no matter what your goals are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're hunting public land, the first thing you should be looking for is those edges, the transition from one habitat type to another. You're going to find that edge, and I guarantee that's where you're going to find the most of your deer activity. That's obviously where all your scrapes are, and that's because those deer transition through those areas. But the type of edge that we're talking about, it attracts deer a lot too, because it is a very productive type of habitat. That's where it's that balance of cover, and it really just comes down to the amount of sunlight that type of cover or that ecosystem gets, and it's the most productive. That's where your mass bearing or fruit trees generally develop or prosper. But for a deer, from a deer's perspective, or any wildlife, it's like, you can follow this edge. There's this abundance of food, and if I feel a threat, I'm a hop, skip, and a jump, and I'm in exactly. cover, and I'm protected. So,
yeah, for sure. I think there's a lot of good things there. One thing. Couple different areas to go. One thing that you've mentioned, and I think it's this was on the previous podcast, that is a great visualization as well in terms of pressure and everything else. But the air mattress example, like when you stand on an air mattress, everything goes other corner, go stand over there, other corner, and explain that in a little bit more detail, because I think when people start thinking of that, so just one example here. I hardly hunted behind my house this year because there wasn't really a deer that I wanted to shoot, but there was still a presence still there on the farm. And so there was a hedgerow to the west of there. And it was very apparent that's where I would say like the 3-year-old and 4-year-old buck was hanging. And then as soon as they started hunting, that went to my farm. And it's like just that air mattress anomaly of like, that's exactly, it's so crystal clear. So I think it's something for people can think in their mind on public or private or no matter where they're at. So go ahead and explain that.
Yeah. So again, pressure, the second of those 4 key elements. And the thing that I try to get everyone to understand is that pressure limits potential at the end of the day. I mean, if you want me to summarize the concept of whitetail consulting in a nutshell, it's getting you to understand that keeping pressure off your property is going to improve your situation. So how do we do that, right? We can improve our habitat, like I said, increase the cover, or we can change our habits, the consistency factor, and just our overall human presence. But the big thing there is to understand that pressure is a relative concept, or it's a relative term. I see this a lot where I'll have a client that's backed up to a big property. Maybe it's a game preserve. Well, you're fairly close to a couple of those, right?
No,
no, but you get backed up to these properties that have zero hunting pressure at all. So even if you have a really good property and you're hunting relatively smart, the little bit of pressure you're putting on is still the most pressure in the area. And then, that air mattress analogy, if you visualize that partially deflated air mattress and you step on one corner of it, where does the rest of that air go? Goes to the other end. And that's exactly how those bucks operate. I mean, I've learned that over time in our area, especially because I learned it mostly when I started communicating with my neighbors a lot more. And what would happen, we'd share trail cam pics at the end of the season and throughout the season, but not, we're not tipping each other off on where to set up or anything by any means, but you just start to get a better feel for where those deer move, because you only know what they're doing on your property when they're on your property.
You only
right?
assume what they're doing elsewhere.
Correct. But then you start to see, it's like, okay, there's pressure here. He went over there. And then he was over there until there was pressure over there. Now he's back over here. And then all of a sudden he just disappeared from both of our cameras because both of us or both properties had too much pressure. Well, then where does he go? Who knows? Gets shot. You never hear him again. He gets shot by the neighbor down the road who you don't have communication with or whatever it may be. But yeah, pressure is such a important factor. And that's exactly it. I mean, those bucks just won't tolerate it. And the older they get, the less pressure they're going to tolerate. So that's another important consideration for people to understand is my number one rule of pressure that I educate guys on is does, fawns, and young bucks will tolerate certain levels of pressure that mature bucks will not. So you cannot let the activity of those does, fawns, and young bucks be an indicator for the activity of what those mature bucks are going to do. And this is a very, very common misconception where people are like, well, I can do that, and the does and fawns and stuff still show up, so I can get away with that, right? But that just doesn't work with those mature bucks. They don't take the same risks that those younger deer do. And the does, they adapt to so much and just tolerate it. So
yeah, I think that's something that people can take no matter where they're hunting, or maybe they go out of state and they're noticing. I mean, it's not rocket science, but to look at it in that way is really important. So where's the air pumped up? That's probably where the bucks are going to be because of all the pressure elsewhere. So I think that's just a really good indication.
Well, yeah, and you make a good point. I mean, you can take that anywhere. So whether you're looking at your property or you're hunting public land, I do the bulk of my hunting in Wisconsin. I hunt public in Minnesota and sometimes in Iowa. But I've hunted whitetails in Georgia. I've hunted whitetails in Arizona, the Coos deer. And it's the same exact concept. I mean, it doesn't even matter whitetail aside. It's the same thing. We're hunting mule deer and antelope. Where's that pressure? Wind pressure, food timing. The wind is going to dictate a lot, more so on your property. And I like to utilize that wind as that sort of that process of elimination. That wind is going to dictate where those bucks are bedding on any given day. So you can automatically rule out certain bedding areas based on what the wind's doing that day. And then obviously it's going to dictate where you can hunt and how you can access the adjacent pinch point to where you think that buck is bedding. That's in its simplest form. That's how I utilize the wind. Then pressure, that's going to dictate also where they're bedding, where's that pressure. And then obviously the food source, that's going to dictate where they're moving to and from throughout most of the, their weekly or daily patterns. And then obviously the timing of the year. But one example of that in Arizona, we went out there a few times now, just over the counter tags, hunting Coos deer in the foothills of the mountains. I mean, we're only 30 miles from the Mexico border. Haven't been out there the last couple of years because I'd have to focus on other things other than just hunting deer. But the first year we were out there, we set up camp in this really cool area down in the foothills, probably quarter mile from the mountains, and saw just a ton of deer, absolute ton of deer, lots of bucks, had some pretty good encounters, and it was a great time, and then we went out the next year and it was completely different. Well, the major difference between those 2 years was how dry it was the second year. The first year there was water running through a couple of these drainages. Those drainages were a little bit more green, but the big thing was there's water out all over the place, so these deer could drink in a lot of different areas. When the second year came around and it was so dry, all these deer were congregating around water sources, and those water sources had been hunted through the whole season. And we were hunting out there like basically the last week of the season, and there's just no deer around. Plain and simple, there was no deer around. And we talked to a lot of the locals, and they'd been hunting hard down in these same areas that we hunted the year prior. And so we just went a little bit deeper and got up in the mountains and ended up finding all the mature bucks right up just a little bit higher up on the mountain. And then you just look at it and you're like, well, why is that? Because they got pushed. There's no water up in the mountain, so they're still coming down and getting water, but they're doing it again after dark. But they got pushed by that pressure, the low pressure, pushed up towards the top of the mountain there, and that's where we ended up finding them. And it was a pain in the ass to hunt them up there.
I could imagine. Yeah. For sure. But yeah, to your point, yeah, it's transcendent no matter where you're at and what game you're hunting. So that's really important. Now let's see, something that we were talking about here previously is just, I think for the better, I think a lot of people are looking at more no-till and a lot of just different, more holistic approaches to managing properties, which I think is really cool. And that's something that you're really passionate about as well. So I think, and based off your background and what you do, talk a little bit about some of your goals when it comes to actually food plotting, because to your point, we're all pseudo farmers, and that might even be more than what we're due credit for. So give like a 101 on some of your goals and ideas and strategies when it comes to implementing food plots and trying to improve the actual dirt.
Yeah, well, you already brought up a good topic there to talk about, is the holistic approach to land management in general. And I think that's something that a lot of recreational property owners are missing the ball on, and there's certainly a lot of other whitetail consultants out there that focus purely on the whitetail aspect of hunting property and not the holistic approach. And that's just, it's not good. It's not sustainable, as far as long-term management practices go. If you manage for a single species, especially a single species being a generalist type species like a white-tailed deer that can adapt and live under any conditions. I mean, they can live in your backyard in town and feed solely on bird feeders and, and exotic shrubs. I mean, they can tolerate just about anything. If you manage that way, you're doing the land and the other wildlife a huge disservice there. So the holistic approach, that covers all the spectrums, everything from the wildlife habitat to also how do you get that land to pay for itself so that you can ensure that that land will always be in your family. The thing that I hate to see all the time is a family or a property that's been under ownership from the same family for generations, and then they end up having to sell it because they can't afford to keep it. And if you have a better management approach on any level to how you run that property and get it to pay for itself, not every property is going to be self-sustaining as far as the financial side of things, but a simple thing is like your timber management. If you go in there and get all crazy and take that bigger check short term versus spacing out your cuttings, which are going to be more beneficial for your wildlife, also is kind of spreading those cuttings out, but also, taking a 20-inch walnut tree, if you have a logger come through and he wants to take every tree that's over 16 or 18 inches and all those 20 inchers, well, man, if there's no future trees, and then there's an exponential increase in value of a 20-inch tree to a 24 or 26-inch tree. It's just a matter of waiting 10 years or 15 years for that tree to grow to that. So, that side of things is huge. One of the big things I'm working on with most of my clients right now is helping them put together better strategies and long-term goals to produce that income on their property with the tillable land in general. I think it's just too easy to fall into this trap or this routine where you buy a property or you've had a property for a long time and you lease it to the cash cropper down the road, and you get, it actually blows my mind how little money a lot of these guys get.
That's changing. That's changing.
It is.
Yeah. But go ahead.
It is. No, it definitely is. But, a lot of it too is, it's just the discomfort that comes with having conversations with the guy who's farmed it for a long time. But, even if you're getting $200 an acre to lease that tillable land, there's ways that you can make significantly more money off of that land. That's significantly better for the wildlife and better for the environment. And these things all kind of play into the food plot topic that we were talking about earlier. And that is, that prioritizing the soil health in that food plot and the long-term health of that soil or on that land is going to be, it's really the only sustainable thing that you can do on the property. And that's where I made a big push. I'm probably going on 4 years now of purely no-till. I mean, I do till from time to time, a lot of times when I'm establishing plots and whatnot, but focusing on no-till food plot practices and getting away from chemical dependency are the biggest things. And I will say also that every single client that I've ever worked with, as soon as I tell them that there's a way to food plot without
third
chemicals,
eye in your forehead.
they're excited.
Well, it's a huge line item.
Yeah, for sure. No one out there wants to use the spray if they don't have to, right? No one wants to be exposed to that. And that's really what prompted me, is when I started, a lot of the things that I was doing throughout my whole life, you start to reevaluate those things when you have kids. I mean, having kids is next level education of being a human being. You start to see things through a totally different perspective. And if you're a good parent, then you start to think a lot more about the future and what they're going to be presented with. And I think we can all, in our generation, especially, we can look around and see that the things that we've been told for the last 20 years aren't necessarily the most beneficial for the future of, our own personal health and certainly the health of the planet. And it's all connected at the end of the day, right? The health of that soil is inevitably the health of us, because the foods that are grown from that soil end up in our body. And the same is true with the deer. So there's a lot going on there. And yeah, I push hard to go away from chemicals, and I'm not 100% anti-chemical by any means. I do think that chemicals, when used as directed, are a very, very valuable tool in the land manager's arsenal, but you should strive to have a chemical free or limited chemical routine, because it's those routines that cause the problems, right?
Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit more about that process. Let's say someone has an established food plot right now. They've had it for a few years. They've really knocked back some of those weeds that are going to come back annually. So right now it's February, and let's say they had a bean plot. So what is step one this spring and then throughout the year to try to limit any sort of chemicals if possible?
Well, so there's 5 principles of soil health that you really need to understand. And if you follow these principles of soil health, then you're going to have much more successful chemical free plots in general. And the biggest thing, the first principle of those 5 principles, is protecting the soil at all times. You want to keep it covered. So a bean field, even a cornfield's a little bit better when that, if it's shelled corn and a lot of the thatch and stuff gets put back on the ground. Bean fields don't have as much of that, but when that field's not covered, it's a natural reaction by Mother Nature to produce the weeds there, because it needs ground cover. Yeah, I mean, if you think of soil, the simplest analogy is just think of soil as the skin of the earth, and you hear people say that all the time. It's like if you have an open wound, which is bare dirt essentially, the earth wants to heal that, and that's where weeds really come in. You have the early successional weeds that take over as like kind of a nurse crop, so to speak, and then it kind of evolves from there. But the first and foremost is having cover on that ground all the time. So I would never, ever, ever at this point plant a bean field and not be broadcasting rye or even brassicas into that as that cool season cover crop at the end of the year. One, you're going to just automatically level up your food plot game by adding diverse food sources in that feeding location for those deer. But 2, you're going to protect that soil from erosion, from the sun exposure. UV exposure is probably one of the most often overlooked aspects of tilled soil. But on the erosion topic too, we always think of erosion as it rains a lot and it washes out ditches in the field. Well, if you're out tilling or disking and that soil gets nice and dry, we all I was in this mindset too for a long time, but we like to see that nice powdery soft soil, that nice,
the smell of fresh dirt is nice.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But that's a problem. And if you see dust flying up behind your plow or your disc, or even when the farmer next door is doing it, you take the thickness of a printer paper off of 1 acre of property, that's 1 ton of topsoil that just blew away with the wind. So that's actually a more common form of erosion that's often overlooked. And on that note, the second principle of soil health is minimizing the soil disturbance. And a big reason for that is when you disturb that soil, again, you set it up for failure right out of the gate, where you're opening up to exposure of erosion, the UV exposure and whatnot. And you're breaking down the biology of that soil. And there's more living organisms in the top 2 inches of soil than there is in the entire planet combined. And those living organisms are solely responsible for breaking down nutrients and converting them into something that the next level or the next generation can use, where it's the next growing season of plants can utilize those nutrients, and then they end up in an animal at the end of the day, or they break them down where they just keep on cycling them through, and so on and so forth. So you have to minimize that soil disturbance, or you don't ever get that biology to actually be activated and thrive in the topsoil. And then the third of those 5 principles of soil health is plant diversity. And this is a big one, because if you plant a monocrop, if you're only doing beans or you're only doing corn, I get a big kick out of guys and these days where I think, and again, I'm not holding anything against people with this mindset. I think it's just an education thing. But the mindset of oscillating back and forth between corn and beans, and we see farmers do it all the time. Corn pulls a lot of nitrogen from the soil, beans put nitrogen in the soil. So it makes sense, right? We could do this back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Well, at the end of the day, it is more beneficial than just doing corn on corn on corn on corn or beans on beans. And obviously you're reducing the risk of pathogens and plant disease by alternating, and obviously the insects and all sorts of stuff. But if you plant a very diverse blend every single time, or you're planting something and adding, you're top dressing it with a cover crop or whatnot, now you have this network of plants in the soil that are harboring certain nutrients and utilizing certain nutrients at the same time. And then this goes back to minimizing soil disturbance. So when you don't till or disturb the soil to the degree that we're used to with plows or discs or tillers, then you allow that mycorrhizal fungi to develop and create this network amongst your plant community, amongst your root systems and all this stuff. So
that's usually what people, if they buy something, they dip that into that product because it's been extracted from the soil in most row crop situations.
Correct. And what you'll see a lot of times, if you've ever done any extensive landscaping or, new construction, or you get crazy with your tillage, that's really why they do a lot more heavy tillage, is to disturb that soil, because then they don't get as much competition within the soil. But when you do a lot of like heavy landscaping or something, you plant a tree or a shrub in dirt that's been moved, maybe you actually get earth movers in and they're taking a bunch of topsoil off here and haul it over here and stirring all this stuff up, or it sits in a pile all summer and then they spread it around at the end of the year. You're not going to have very healthy or quick plant growth in that soil, because it doesn't have the fungus in there. So when you dip the roots in that mycorrhizal dip, it gives it a big head start. The biggest thing with that mycorrhizal fungi is the ability to transfer moisture throughout the soil. That's another thing. When you keep that soil covered and don't disturb it, it retains a lot more moisture. Correct. But then the ability to create this network where these plants, so you have like your grasses, for example, your rye, wheats, oats, stuff like that. They're really good at harboring minerals like phosphorus from the soil. And they've got deep root systems that can go real deep and pull that up from the ground. And then you have other plants like your clovers and your beans and peas, your legumes, that are good at pulling nitrogen out of the atmosphere and putting it in those, or storing it in those nodules in the root system. Well, your grasses utilize a lot of that nitrogen. They need that nitrogen to thrive. And when you have that mycorrhizal fungi network, then they can transfer those nutrients back and forth amongst each other. And it's just a healthier plant community in general. And then when you keep, and this is the fourth of those 5 principles, is that continual living plant or root system. When you always have a living plant in that soil, you're always setting the next generation up for more success. Where, if you have a plant growing there and then you terminate that crop and you plant another one, just that cavity or that space that root has created in the soil, when that, and especially if you have a lot of microbial activity in the soil, it'll break down that dead root pretty quickly, but it has this void there. So your next plant that grows, it can fill that void with its root system very, very quickly. So it's not pushing through a hard pan with that. It can just get a good head start, and then it kind of expands from there. And that's why you see with long-term no-till practices, you see way, way, way better water infiltration into the ground. And that's also why you see places where there's a lot of tillage. You drive past these big fields and you get like an inch and a half of rain and it looks like a lake out in the middle of that field, because there's a hard pan. And also the overall structure of that soil has been broken down and degraded from the tillage, where when it rains, it just packs down and that water sits on top, or it all runs off and it takes all the nutrients or topsoil or the synthetic fertilizers and chemicals with it, and it ends up in the watershed. And then you can see the time-lapse photography over the years of what the Gulf of Mexico looks like from all these farming practices and whatnot. So those are all big things. And then the fifth of those 5 soil health principles is animal integration. And if you want to have healthy soil, the healthiest soil you can have, you have to integrate animals into that ecosystem, and they're there as the nutrient cycling medium, essentially. And, you learn these things. I just got into this stuff a few years back, but when I start learning it, and then I, kind of overlap that with what I learned in college from biology standpoint, it's pretty easy to look back in history and tell that from the time that white settlers hit this country and removed the large animals from the landscape, i.e. the buffalo herds, our soils have been declining rapidly, where, plants grow, animals come through, they graze them down, they eat X percentage, they trample the rest down, and allows that soil, that healthy soil, to break down that carbon and put it back into the ground, and then the byproduct of those large animals grazing that is, one, like nowadays when we think bison and beef are essentially the same animal, or same tool, I should say, they convert that into high quality protein, and then the byproduct of that is high quality fertilizer, those nutrients that are cycled back into the ground, and then a very small percentage of it goes up into the atmosphere due to flatulence, right? So that's that's one of my big beefs right now with the whole climate crisis issue. Is we are absolutely facing a crisis, but it's not what the media and the mainstream narrative is pushing, because what they're pushing is going to make some people a lot of money. And that's the problem, is that there's a lot of people that are aware of that, but then it's too easy to be like, well, no, it's really not that big of a deal. What they're saying isn't true. It is absolutely true. And they're just missing the big picture on it. So everything that they push, where, obviously this big thing now where they want us to reduce our meat consumption because they claim that, that livestock and the animals are the cause of our problems. It's so far from the truth. Even driving cars and everything that's not the cause of our carbon issues. The cause of our carbon issues is the fact that we have right now, beginning of February, we have 50% of our country is barren ground with no living organisms in that soil that should be cycling nutrients and pulling carbon down into the ground. That's not happening. And we removed all those animals from the landscape, and just the overall farming practices in general are very poor. So we're not using that as a tool to put carbon in the ground. And I saw this interview last week or 2 weeks ago. Anderson Cooper was interviewing Bill Gates on essentially being a hypocrite with his approach on climate change, and how, the whole world needs to revisit how we're doing things so that we can, have a positive carbon footprint, or I guess negative carbon footprint, right? We're taking care of the carbon issue instead of adding to the problem. And then he called Bill Gates out on how he's flying around the world all the time in his private jet and all these things. The big thing with Bill Gates is that he is the largest owner of farmland in this country. He owns right now, he owns like 270,000 acres of land that are all farmed the quote unquote conventional way, which is all, 100% chemical, synthetic fertilizers and mechanized operations and everything. But what I found funny about that is Bill Gates' his rebuttal was that, he's investing in biofuels for his jets. And he's also investing in these companies that are inventing machines that capture carbon from the air and put it in the ground. So I went down a rabbit hole on that because I wanted to learn more about it. And you just have to laugh. You really have to laugh. I mean, at this point, I'm sure that most of the people listening to this podcast don't buy into or believe anything that comes out of that guy's mouth. But the whole time he's talking about investing millions and millions of dollars into the development of a machine that can pull carbon from the air and put it in the ground. And all I'm thinking is, dude, we've got plants. That's what plants do. They pull carbon from the air, they put it in the ground. Yes, exactly. So yeah, I ran a bunch of math on that too. You look at and this, some of the food plotters out there can relate to this. So if you look at your soil analysis and you look at the organic matter in your soil analysis, or on your soil analysis, that essentially is the dead or decomposing organic life in your soil, i.e. the carbon in your soil. Most conventionally farmed fields are running right around 2 or 3% organic matter. And, I've been on some properties that were way worse than that. Actually, I've got a client in Missouri that bought a property that was just used and abused for a long time. and his was at like 1.4%.
Mm.
It was pretty bad. But if you run the math on that, an increase of 1% of organic matter per acre is the equivalent of putting about 18 tons of carbon into the soil. And this machine that Bill Gates is investing in, it takes it a year to produce 0.01 metric tons of carbon to capture it from the air. So, and obviously it requires carbon to build that machine. It requires carbon to run that machine, all this stuff. So again, at the end of the day, you follow those principles of soil health, the animal integration is the biggest thing. And that's where we're missing the boat in this country. Is if we farmed better, we could still do a lot of the crops we're doing, but on a better rotation, better cover crops, integrating animals. Now you have this byproduct of healthy soil that is high quality animal proteins that we could be feeding our country with at the same time. So how does that relate to the hunter,
we probably lost a few people. So
but how does that relate to the pseudo farmer out there? I mean, the big issue here is that most people doing food plots are following the conventional practices that were pushed by the agricultural industry, which are not the best practices. And from my standpoint, we as hunters, we're the frontline conservationists in this country, right? If we're not taking the right measures or the right approach to soil conservation, maybe it is only a quarter acre food plot, or maybe you're a guy who has 45 acres of food plots, or maybe you're a guy who has a decent sized recreational property and you're leasing the cropland to the cash cropper down the road and he's farming this way. You have control over that land, and that land's all, those decisions ultimately lie on you. So the degradation of that land through the farming practices, maybe they're making you $200 an acre right now, but they're pulling so much from that soil and not putting anything back to that soil that down the road you're going to be left with completely unproductive, just low quality land on that portion of your property.
Dependent on inputs too, which I think we were talking earlier, and I've been reading a couple books with Joel Salatin, and he is very much similar to what you're talking about, like getting away with fertilizer and a lot of these different things. And the story or how he illustrates this is a pretty interesting background, but he ended up in the eastern part of the States where soil was really crappy. And when they originally bought that farm, they could only run like 10 cows on 100 acres. And then throughout improving the soil with a lot of things that we're discussing, he can run 100 cows on that particular parcel because of how much the soil improved and all the just top to bottom of what you're able to do and what we're discussing. So I'm just thinking from, okay, well, I like big deer. So how do I transverse that? Like, well, if this soil could only support 10 cows, then it improves so much. Well, how many deer can it support, or how healthy can those deer and hopefully grow bigger racks too?
Well, so here, that's a good topic there as well. I mean, it goes way deeper than just no-till and cover crop rotations and everything. And I think if anyone can, if anyone's on the fence right now on the no-till side versus what they've conventionally been doing, like, here's some information for you. And I won't go down this rabbit hole either, because I know there's a lot of people out there that are on the other side of this coin, but some information that you should definitely take into consideration and do some research on, because you're never going to hear this nuanced perspective from the mainstream narrative. Now, one thing to note is we should all be aware that big ag and big pharma are essentially the same companies in this country, right? So the same players that push the chemicals used on our cropland are the same players that are selling you some remedy to the ailments that you're suffering from these chemicals in every aspect of our lives at this point, the food system, the water, and all this stuff. But a big controversial topic right now, and this goes hand in hand with the no-till practice, is the use of glyphosate, right? And all these studies are coming out and they're proving now, glyphosate saturations and is showing up in people's bodies in general, and there's all these adverse effects. That's a whole other topic, and that's not by any means my area of expertise. I'm not a medical professional, but from a biological standpoint, the use of glyphosate on your food plots, even if you're spraying Roundup Ready beans or Roundup Ready corn, it absolutely will have, without a shadow of a doubt, a negative effect on the quality of your antler size, right? I mean, above and beyond everything else. I mean, overall, it's just not good. But if we want to fixate on
if we want people to listen up, that's what we got to tell them.
Yes. So I think this is a big thing a lot of people don't understand with glyphosate, because you hear this stuff all the time. And again, I was in this boat forever. I mean, I grew up on a large dairy farm. We had these big chemical representatives at our farm all the time, schmoozing us, bringing donuts, chatting with us, sending us to box seats at Packer games, stuff. I mean, they do what they can to persuade you in this direction. And I don't hold anything against farmers farming this way. A lot of it, again, is just lack of education and understanding, because if you're a farmer where you have no extra time, I mean, and I say farmer, but again, food plotter is a farmer during certain times, and most guys with recreational properties don't have excess time to put into that property, right? A lot of guys, for the most part, they have to work their full-time job as much as they can to afford to even have that property to begin with. So I completely understand it. So when someone comes along and says, hey, here's a solution that's going to save you time and money, and it basically ensure that you have success in whatever you're doing, plant with your crop, then yeah, people are going to eat that up. But we know now that this is becoming a problem, and we have too many chemicals saturating our soil. But the glyphosate thing in general is alarming to me. And as it relates to big deer, big bucks, growing big antlers in general, the mechanism for how glyphosate works and actually how it, affects the environment, it's pretty obvious that there's going to be some long-term effects here if we don't get ahead of it. So glyphosate, everyone thinks of it as this broad spectrum foliar herbicide, right? So it's essentially it's a chemical herbicide you can spray on a living plant, and it'll kill, for the most part, anything that's green, as long as it's not genetically modified to be resistant to it. And the way that actually works, the mechanism of activation there is it's attacking certain enzymes in that plant and breaking it down. And then the genetically modified plants, they're immune to that. They've got blockers in there, whatever it might be. Again, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but what most people don't know is that glyphosate was actually patented like 10 or 15 years, I think 10 years prior to its use as a herbicide. It was patented as a pipe cleaning compound because of its ability to keep not so much that, as more of a descaler, because of its ability to chelate minerals within that pipe. And the concept of chelation, essentially it ties up these elements or these molecules and makes them unusable in their form, and then it can flush a pipe. So you have if you have lime buildup on your shower walls in your bathroom and you spray it with CLR, that's a chelator, where it basically bonds to those molecules and makes it so that you can scrub them off, and then they flush them down the drain. So when you spray glyphosate on your food plot and that ends up in your soil, it has the same exact properties, and it's chelating essential minerals in that soil, including calcium and magnesium and iron and all these things that your deer need to be, first and foremost, healthy, but secondly, that they need to actually develop racks. I mean, for an animal to build up the amount of minerals in its body to grow as much bone as it can grow during such a short period of time, and then its food source, or one of its food sources that you are providing for it, essentially is short on those minerals. I mean, you're doing your animals a disservice that way. So that's just one small area there that I think people need to be more aware of. And beyond that, healthy soil equates to more nutrition in the soil, right? Which equates to more nutrition in the plant, i.e. higher palatability, which equates to more attractive plants for those deer to feed on, beyond just being beneficial. But they're select feeders, where you watch a deer go through the woods and it's not chewing down all of this or all that. It's nibbling a little bite here, a little bite there, because they can sense the highest palatability of any portion of that plant, and they'll nibble that off and nibble that off. And one day they show up in your food plot and all they eat is clover, and the next day they show up and they don't touch the clover, and all they do is eat the brassicas or the beans, whatever it may be. When you have a higher or a healthier soil in your food plot, you automatically have healthier plants with more nutrition. And again, if you go back to the glyphosate debate there, we know without a shadow of a doubt, research has proven all of this, that glyphosate is tying up minerals in the soils that are no longer bioavailable to whatever is consuming that plant. And that's largely in part for a lot of these diseases that humans are suffering right now. These diseases that we've never really seen until the last 20 years, most of them are caused by mineral deficiencies, which, again, if you want to go down a whole nother rabbit hole, you can get into the CWD debate. And and we know that healthy soils are very successful at destroying and eliminating pathogens and diseases, and unhealthy soils are not so much. So I'm not putting this all on the food plotter, but the guy who has a food plot that, like most of my plants, I try to create transition food plots as these deer move out to the bigger ag fields. We're only a small portion of that, but if those deer are feeding on our food plots and they're going out to a big ag field, and both of which are sprayed with glyphosate and these minerals are tied up, that can be a big problem. That's one of the biggest reasons why I push really hard on establishing or reestablishing good quality native browse on a property. A lot of these guys out here are completely okay with half of your property being covered in honeysuckle or autumn olive or whatever invasive shrub it might be, because it is a very good form of cover for those deer, but it doesn't provide any nutritional benefit for them. They don't really browse on it, at least not enough to be beneficial to them. When you have native shrubs or hardwood regeneration, now you're talking about a deeper root system, a perennial root system that's constantly harboring minerals and nutrients from the soil.
More nutrients.
Correct. And it brings it up into a usable form that those deer have evolved to consume and process and benefit from. So, my philosophy is pretty dang simple when it comes to improving habitat on a property or even setting up a property. It's, if you focus on high quality, diverse native habitat, and then you add in a little bit of strategic design as far as where you want to put those most attractive food sources, it obviously have your thicker, more dense cover for your bedding areas. And then between that bedding area and that food plot, you've got the most accessible pinch point on your property that you can hunt, get in and out of without putting pressure on your deer. That's really all it takes to have a successful hunting property. Now, obviously it's easier for me to say that than to just throw that together. But, again, that's why all these things come into play. And I think the more people learn about this stuff and the more they understand, like, it's not, your problems aren't going to be solved by some magic bean in a bag that you put in the ground. It might pull those deer in short term. You're going to see an increase of activity and more opportunities for success, but that's very short lived. And I try to get my clients to understand the long-term aspects of this game that we're involved in. And I truly believe that hunters can save the world, right? We are the only ones that are this intimately tied to the environment at this point in society, right? For the most part, farmers are obviously very, very connected to the land. So I don't want to make anyone mad on that aspect, but the bulk of the people farming these large chunks of ground are not tied to the land the way they used to be 20 years ago. When it was all these small families farming these small farms and their entire livelihood depended on the productivity or the success of that land, things were a lot different versus now when you have farmers farming giant tracts of land. And at the end of the day, they don't really care what's going on because the government's subsidizing everything on that land. So whether it's successful or not, they're getting paid, and that's, and then again, all this stuff trickles down from the top where, ultimately it is the government's fault where they're perpetrating the use of all these things because, well, let's be honest, they're all in bed with the same companies at the end of the day. So I think there's a lot there. Obviously it's a lot for people to unpack if they joined into this episode to learn about trail cameras, but
no, I think if anything, it provokes some more thoughts. But I would say just to break down some things that people can implement. Like, okay, so this is I want to make an impact here. How do I do that? So they have these traditional food plots, and one of the key principles was just keeping soil, keeping the soil covered and doing cover crops. So as we roll into spring, like what are some actual things that people can plant? And then they still want to plant those, let's say, grains this fall. So do they just drill right into that existing cover crop? How do they kill that existing cover crop? I mean, break down some of the tactics that someone can jot down some notes and implement this year.
Obviously, everything's situational, right? Like it's dependent on your actual situation. And I would say the biggest barrier to entry when it comes to no-till plots is the cost of a no-till drill.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you don't have to use a no-till drill. You can get away with other means. If you would have asked me 2 or 3 years ago, I would have said, you're as long as you're no-tilling, it's better than you can no-till and spray, and that's better than tilling and spraying on top of it, right? But the research that I've dug into and learned about in the last couple of years, and especially all this glyphosate stuff, and again, having kids of my own and looking at them and being like, man, I want to do everything I possibly can to give them the best and brightest future ever. And when I go out in the woods and I pull a deer out of the woods, like it feels really good to feed my family food that came from a natural environment that I know is free of hormones and free of these chemicals. But if I'm spraying my food plots and putting all this stuff on the food plot, then it's really not a chemical free environment, right? And it's not really like a truly like organic or natural meat by any means. So that's one aspect of it. But as far as getting into it, there's a lot of ways that you can do it. First and foremost, my best advice up front is start small and have a good plan. Because if you don't have a plan going into it, you're going to try something one way or another, and it's inevitably going to fail. And then you're just going to revert back to your old ways that you know how. So what I would suggest is don't rush into it. Maybe do 50% of your food plots no-till, chemical free in general, and then kind of figure out your process so that you still have something going on one side of that plot, or one plot or the other. So start small there, but you have to figure out your own routine. And I think a lot of it with establishment of the food plots is the timing factor. And I haven't perfected this by any means. I mean, it's very easy for me to roll into a property with a no-till drill and a sprayer and basically say, okay, we're going no-till now. And within 3 seasons, we shouldn't have to spray anymore because we're not stirring up the seed bank and releasing all the weed seeds that are sitting in the soil. And, there's decades and decades worth of weed seeds in that soil. Again, nature's way of protecting the soil when need be. So start small there. And if a no-till drill is an issue, you don't want to purchase a no-till drill, hire someone to do it. I 100% understand the appeal of doing that work. A lot of guys love food plots because it's something that they can do. They can pull a little disc behind. Yeah, it's absolutely fun. But if you don't have the equipment or you're not willing to invest in the equipment, what I suggest is just hiring. Or, again, you've heard me talk about this before. I'm really big on communicating with my neighbors. Communication creates common goals. And if you talk to your neighbors and you start to say stuff to them like, hey, I'm thinking about doing this no-till food plot thing, and explain the benefits of why, everything we talked about today, maybe you can get enough guys on board where you can buy a drill and they can pay you to do it and make up those costs, or you guys all share the cost, whatever it may be. It just depends on how close you are.
Or try to rent one from the NRCS office too. A lot of them throughout the country, you can rent them.
Yeah, you can absolutely do that. And then that, again, you have to have a good plan and good timing to plan ahead. And that's another issue. And that's why I think a lot of food plotters are chemically dependent right now, is they don't plan ahead. And they're like, oh, I've got this weekend to do food plots. I'm going to run out and spray this quick and do that. And again, I totally get it. But establishment and the timing is absolutely critical. Once you get things established, and again, generally what I do with my clients is I try to get them in a 3-year routine, and by year 3, we're chemical free. Now, I've since changed that approach up a little bit because of the disturbing research that I come across all the time. So I'm trying new things out. And one really easy way to get a high quality food plot established is just go pure rye right off the bat. Cereal rye is an allelopathic seed, so it releases chemicals when it starts to grow or when it germinates, which basically hinder germination of other seeds in the soil. And it also grows really fast. So I'm doing 2 test plots right now, new plots establishment. One of them I put in at the end of September, and the other one I put in the middle of October last year during the cool season. And that's another benefit of cereal rye, is that it will germinate down to like 34 or 35 degrees, and it'll grow at like 40 degrees or something. So when most of your other annual weed seeds aren't able to germinate or grow, this can grow. And then, it's alive, that living roots in the soil, protecting everything throughout the winter underneath the snow. As soon as the snow melts off and it warms up, it's going to green up right away. I mean, 35 degrees, it'll be green.
First thing that greens up.
Yep. So you're providing, automatic or immediate feed for your deer, especially when those does are trying to put on the weight to fawn, and your bucks are obviously trying to recuperate from the winter and build up their reserves so they can start growing antlers. So that's all there. But the more important side of it is that it's going to grow fast. It's going to choke out all the weeds. And then the beautiful thing with rye is once it hits, it's the easiest crop to terminate. I mean, once it hits the sexual maturity stage where it starts to produce the seed heads, you can run it over with a yard roller. And if it's a healthy stand of rye, it'll kink the stem right off. If maybe you need a roller crimper to do so. So that's part of it. If you don't have a drill, I've had successful plots where I start with rye, and then I go and I broadcast into the standing rye, and then I roll it down and create this thatch layer over the seeds, and then it holds that moisture in, and then you'll get the next generation to grow up through it. Your germination rate's not going to be quite as high, so you have to increase your application of your seed rate. But it's a very effective way to do it. Again, a no-till drill is going to be above and beyond the most effective means to do that, but rolling it down and crimping it with that next generation underneath that thatch layer is a whole nother way to do it. Now, if you want to get really outside the box, back to those 5 principles of soil health and animal integration specifically, I've actually got a few clients right now on a program where we do the same exact process, but instead of roll or crimping the crop to terminate it, we broadcast the next generation of seed into it, and then we're dumping cattle in that food plot at a high stocking rate for a short period of time. And they get in there, they eat X percentage of it, they fertilize the plot, they trample everything down, they're terminating a lot of it, they're pushing the seed into the soil, so they're integrating that seed into the seed bed, and then we get them out of there, and the plots are phenomenal. So one big thing to note with all this stuff, and this is a big thing in general, is the concept of the aesthetics of your food plot. Right. And this is a conversation I always try to have with the clients too, because, first and foremost, the term weed, a weed growing in your food plot, that's a relative thing as well. Right. Most of the time, those weeds growing in your food plot are a native weed, and they're probably a valuable food source for some type of native wildlife. So if you have weeds in your food plot here or there, they're not really a big deal. If you have a lot of them where they're starting to choke it out, then it becomes more of a problem. But for the most part, you can go into a food plot that's got a couple weeds, and honestly, you can walk through there with a machete by hand and just top those weeds off before they go to seed. And most of them are annual or biannual weeds where if they don't go to seed within a couple generations, they're gone. Mm-hmm. So that's one big thing. The second thing with aesthetics is if you're planting this diverse blend, it's not going to be as pretty initially, because again, the aesthetic side is what you see with your eye. So it's not going to be as pretty to you as this nice, clean soybean field or this nice, clean brassica plot, but it's so much more beneficial. And we need to, as a whole, we need to just change that concept of what we think is aesthetically pleasing to us and think about what's actually living in there. And that's going to be a lot better for us all in the long run.
Mm-hmm. One way for people that this is the easiest way I learned. I had a buddy, he works for the NRCS. And so we were out on a farm, and it was a row crop field, and there was like a buffer strip of pollinators, warm season grasses. Took a shovel, boom. Look at how the soil was just compacted. There's nothing else. And then take a shovel. We burnt it off, so there wasn't like the roots in there necessarily, but you could just see just the structure of the soil was so much different. And I assume
looked like chocolate cake.
Yeah, exactly. It had all the different structures inside that. And I think for anyone to visualize this, that's something that they could easily do. And I assume that's obviously the goal of what you eventually want your food plots to be, because if we're doing the same thing that row crop farmers are doing, then it's going to look like that versus doing something like this. It's going to have a lot more health.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that structure you're talking about is referred to as aggregation in the soil. So when those living organisms are in the soil and they're breaking down the nutrients, they're releasing gases and oxygen and stuff into the soil, and those plants actually need those gases and stuff in the soil, where when you have soil that's over tilled and you break down that structure, it kind of collapses. That structure's collapsed and packed down, and the plants don't do very well in that soil to begin with. So yeah, there's a lot that goes into it for sure. And again, it's just you just gotta kind of get started in it and
let this be the springboard right here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we actually started, me and a buddy of mine who is a regenerative farmer, we just started another podcast just to kind of have conversations like this. It's the Regenerating Nature podcast. We've only done a couple episodes, but just want to have more conversations, and if we can get 5 or 6 more people to listen to it, whatever it might be, it's like you just got to get that ball rolling. And it's 100% an education thing. From my perspective, my background in farming, my background in biology, once I started to learn these things, it was very easy for me to open my eyes and be like, oh yeah, we are facing a big problem here if we continue down this path. And is that problem going to be in our lifetime? I don't know. Is it going to be in my kids' lifetime, the next generation? I don't know, but it's absolutely coming. So why not get ahead of it now? But again, the benefits of doing something like this above and beyond, the dark doom and gloom side of it is it just will absolutely attract more deer and grow bigger, healthier deer on your property by managing your land in a better way. So one of the things that I've been doing with my clients, we start to go down this path, and they see the benefits of no-till, and they see the benefits of removing chemicals from their routine, but they lease a bunch of cropland next, on half their property. So one thing that I would suggest is, again, you control that. So put in your contract with that farmer the way you want him to farm that land, stuff like that. And if you need help with that, that's one of the things that I help a lot of guys with. If you want to put together a contract and a better plan. Now, the next best option, actually the best option in general, is for you to take back more control of that land. And what we're doing now, it's some really, really exciting projects I've got underway right now. We're actually trying to, we talked earlier about how I just try to bring more value to the property in general from that holistic approach. But with how crazy the world's been the last couple of years, what I'm trying to do is utilize these, somewhat neglected or ignored aspects of a recreational property, i.e. the land that they're just, handing off to the farmer, utilize them to create more food security in general for that family, or if it's big enough, for potentially even the local community. So we're actually going into a handful of properties right now and doing alley cropping, where we're building orchards, permaculture type orchards, and then they're cover cropping and grazing intermittently in between these orchards. And the amount of money that you can pull off of your land, if you're just focusing on the financial side of things, is exponentially higher than what you're ever going to get out of a cash cropper. The barrier to entry there is most guys can't afford to or aren't willing to give up that cropland in the short term as these perennial food sources develop, as these trees establish themselves and mature. But what I do, again, we always try to put together a plan, and all of my properties start with a 5-year timeline. And then by year 5, we are reassessing or reevaluating that plan. Did you check all the boxes? Did you miss some of the things? And as far as your management, but if everything goes as planned by year 5, usually you're in management routine instead of establishment routine. But what we do is we just start small. That edge habitat's huge. So if we can take back that edge habitat in some of these areas and get that to produce and start making some money, then we can take back, more edge habitat, or we can draw a couple more lines here or there and create more habitat. So, there's a big opportunity right now for recreational property owners that have tillable land to increase the amount of habitat in general on their property through this process, through what I'm doing with these orchards and the alley cropping aspect. It just, logistically it's hard in some areas, but I bet you most of these guys, if you start looking around, somewhere in your general area, there's a guy that's raising cattle. And then it comes down to connecting that guy with your property instead of the cash cropper, where he has his cattle on your property, portions of your property, X amount of time, and then they're off. And that's really the difference between abuse, and exploitation and regeneration or improvement of the property, is the duration of time that those cattle are on the property. But to put things into perspective, a property plan I just put together on a property, we're going to start with one of these permaculture rows. Actually, it's 2 rows wide. We double them up on the top of this ridge, and it doubles as screening to get in and out of the property, and then obviously the benefits that come with it. But this one row of edge habitat, in 5 to 8 years from now, it's gonna net this guy about $60K a year. So
what's the actual crop or tree that you're like? Apple trees,
so it's
pear trees, mixture?
It's a mixture of chestnuts, apples, pears, plums, all the way down to the shrub level. So we're building these things back the same way you would a forest ecosystem, right? So we have our canopy trees, your bigger trees, those are going to be your chestnut trees in this situation. And then from there, you go down to your understory trees, your shorter trees, the apples and the pears and the plums and such. And then from there, we drop down to that lower layer, the shrub layer, where we're doing hazelnut and elderberry and high bush cranberry, and whatever we can get. It just depends on the soil type and stuff. And then from there, we're even dropping down to like the bramble layer and raspberries and
cool.
haskap. It's like a blueberry type bush and stuff like that. And then you can even incorporate grapes into the system. Your grapes can trellis up the canopy trees, and then it all operates on a U-pick type system. So it's an orchard that's set up where we'll have memberships for local communities where they come out and pick it, and they only have access certain times, so we're not disturbing the property within hunting season. And it completely removes the mechanized aspect of that food production. It's a lot gentler on the land, and that's really, that's a big issue. The root cause at the end of the day of how things are farmed is, the efficiency in harvesting that crop. So if we went 100% full-blown chestnut orchard, then in order to harvest that the most efficient way possible, we'd mow everything off underneath those trees, and then we'd go through there with a machine that picks up the chestnuts off the ground. Whereas if you have an orchard that's structured correctly and you have a plan for it, and then you have a member of this orchard show up, then it's a fun experience. And that's what we're striving for, honestly, is a full-blown nature experience to get people more connected with the land and bring more value to that land beyond just the hunter or the hunting aspect of that land. The hunting improves dramatically because you've increased the amount of habitat. It's a lot of diversity. So, one thing I say all the time, this goes back to the edge habitat, but good high quality deer habitat is for the birds, right? If you focus solely on creating good habitat for songbirds and ground nesting birds, you're automatically going to have high quality habitat for deer. The huntability side just comes down to, that strategic design of where you put those attractive food sources, and again, those secure bedding locations. But when you have a diverse permaculture type orchard, you're pulling in all these birds. So the birds are managing all the bad insects. You don't have the same type of plant growing on top of one another. So you don't have the disease issues, the fungus issues, all this stuff. None of that stuff is a problem. You have wildlife there, but all of my clients understand that, we're doing this for various reasons. That local food security, it brings a lot more money back into local communities, puts a lot more value on that land, and creating that extra habitat for the wildlife. So we're not crazy or gung-ho about harvesting every single morsel off that property, and we just open it up for a very select period of time. And then when that time gap is over, the rest of it's for the wildlife for the rest of the year. And we have a few small projects going like in full operation that the results have been absolutely phenomenal. And it's just kind of created this snowballing effect now too. I mean, the use of animals to manage land, I think there's a big future in it. It just comes down to the logistics of it. It's not realistic for a recreational property owner to have to worry about the cattle aspect of it. But I mean, early settlers used pigs to clear land. That was like their go-to. And I'm actually excited about this project too. I've got a couple client properties this year that we're going to be doing forest farm pigs on some habitat rehabilitation for certain durations of time, certain areas on the property. So I'm really excited to play around with that. And if you dug into the Joe Salatin stuff, you've probably heard him talk about the use of pigs on land and understanding how long they can be there. If they're there too long, they're damaging. If they're there, too little, then they don't really have the same effect. But the right amount of time can, he talks about how the biologists in that area identified a species of grass that hadn't been found on the landscape for like hundreds of years in that area. That's cool. It was all due to his rehabilitation with animal integration. So
yeah, he's a pioneer in this whole category. I encourage anyone. I bought that book for a variety of reasons, or books, just because I wanted to learn more, because he's obviously very forward thinking in a lot of ways. But a lot of the things he was talking about to what we discussed today, a lot of parallels to whitetail hunting. Obviously, that's what anyone listening to this is probably most passionately about, or it's their top three. And so how can you incorporate what someone else is doing and having a lot of success and incorporate it into how you manage your land? And to your point right there, it's like a lot of really exciting things. It's just, you got to dive into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the biggest obstacle here is, and I've seen this happen a lot more over the last decade too, where we kind of all go down our own path. And again, this is why I'm big on communicating with your neighbors with that shared goal. And to get things to work well, I refer to it as holistic logistics, right? Like to get things to really work well and be as efficient as possible, as productive as possible, we have to get more people sharing the same mindset, and then we can do things like I'm talking about with the animal integration. But if you have this preconceived notion that the neighbor next to you is out to kill all your bucks, or maybe he's not even a hunter, maybe he's a farmer and he does his thing and you do your thing, you're missing a huge opportunity. Where again, the simplest thing you can do is like, hey, I just had this conversation with my client the other day. Like, you should approach this neighbor and say, hey, I'll let you pasture your cattle in these areas of my property during these very specific times of the year for access to cross your field to get to the back corner of my property. Because now all of a sudden he can hunt the back corner of his property without disturbing his whole property. And the farmer wins at the same time, but also he's actually winning
and a better relationship.
Twofold, better relationship, but also then he's got the cattle on that property. The best way to manage a grassland is to run cattle through there. Fire and animals are the best way to manage your property if done in the right rotation, in the right duration, right? So it's a win-win for everyone. That's where I'm hoping more people eventually end up, instead of, again, just falling back.
I think it'll happen. I think it'll just take time. I mean, I really think that's what it is. And I think it comes down to a communication thing too. If you're able to document some of these case studies and showcase it, I think more people would be more apt to try some of these things that we discussed here today. But certainly want to be respectful of your time here. I would say if anyone wants to dive into more of what you have going on, top to bottom, with the consulting, property designs, and then the new podcast, and where should folks find you, or anything else that you have exciting coming down the pipeline?
Yeah, I'd say the easiest way to connect with me would be through social media. If you hit up my Instagram account, The Untamed Ambition, you'll find a link there that'll take you to everything you need. Or my website, theuntamedambition.com, all that stuff's on there. And yeah, we do have some exciting stuff coming down the pipe. All these things that I'm talking about today, I just don't have time to share a lot of that stuff, but I'm actually working and finally broke down. I've got a couple guys that I'm working with now to help put out more information. I've never needed to push that stuff out there because I've been too busy, where I wasn't trying to create constant content to recruit clients. But again, the message to me is so important now, where I feel like, if anything, I need to sacrifice some of that time to share that message and at least show people what's going on and show them the other options. Because like I said, every single client that I deal with, they hire me for the exact same reason that we're here talking today, right? It's like, you want to talk about deer. They hire me because they want to learn about deer hunting and how to improve their property for deer. And by the end of the day, the last couple hours of our conversations have very little to do directly with deer, right? It's the overall concept of better land management, true land management, where the holistic approach, where you're managing all aspects of that land for the betterment of the land, the betterment of your family, the betterment of the community, and all those things. So I've got a lot of stuff coming down that I'm excited to share. I'm going to start pushing more videos out as we reapproach all these topics or all these projects in the spring, and even somewhat this winter too. So yeah, hit me up on social media, and yeah, if anyone has any questions or anything, just feel free to reach out. And that's what I do for a living, is answer questions. Right.
Awesome, man. Well, I really appreciate your time. I think we covered a lot of things that I know have not been covered on this podcast before, because we recorded a bunch of them. So I think this should spark some new thoughts.